Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
So this week, we're going to address a topic that I feel like doesn't get discussed enough. Even though the seeds, I feel like, of this discussion are prevalent today. And by that I mean there are all sorts of conversations going on around this concept that are being addressed directly, but no one seems to be addressing this specific topic. And the topic for today is Techno Optimism. Just to start us off with the definition, there actually isn't an Oxford Dictionary definition for Techno Optimism, if you can believe it.
I can believe that because it's a pretty new term, and it only comes up right now in these typical philosophical type discussions. Normally, when discussing artificial intelligence, is when this term comes up.
Mm-hmm. However, that's not where you and I reached this discussion originally.
No.
Funnily enough, but we'll get on to that. The concept of techno-optimism is essentially that, in the broadest strokes, that advancements in technology are generally good, and their positive outcomes outweigh their negative consequences. Right?
Right.
You have no disagreement with that being a general definition?
Nope.
There's I think, perhaps subgroup of people who are techno-optimists that believe any problem can be addressed through technological advancement. And I will go ahead and be honest, for the sake of intellectual honesty, say that I kind of tend to fall in this camp of people, initially anyway.
I know
you know, but maybe our listeners didn't know. And there are some problems with this, especially when it comes to debating how we proceed and about what decisions we should take regarding, for instance, regulations on technology in the case of AI, but also, as a consequence, how we address problems like the problem David and I were originally discussing when we got to the topic of techno-optimism, like climate change, where in order to address this problem, you have to be way out in front of it. You can't address it once it becomes a problem. You have to be very preventative. So, and these are problems in general that human beings, I don't think, are very good at addressing anyway, because we're talking about time frames that are exceeding human lifetimes. And at that point, your selfishness kind of kicks in and goes, well, it won't affect me. And in general, it's hard for us to conceive those time frames anyway. And that's the same as when you're discussing anything on a planetary or extraplanetary scale. You know, people like to talk about, well, the Earth is 4 billion years old.
We just casually throw the word billion around like it means something.
Right, even though when you can't really let that one sink all the way in. It's really difficult to sink in and really put that into perspective. So, anyway, well, while this isn't a devil's advocate video where I will be defending techno-optimism, David and I are on opposing sides on maybe the value of techno-optimism, and I felt it needed to be discussed today. So I guess let's go ahead and start with the first time you and I discussed techno-optimism and kind of start from there, because we never really finished that discussion anyway.
No, we didn't.
Beyond our just assertions. So to reframe the context of our discussion, we were discussing climate change and the threat it poses to humanity and the planet as a whole. And just to preface, neither of us deny that climate change is a problem or a potential problem. We both agree scientifically that it is a problem. However, our initial disagreement was on how we can address this problem. And to which point I arrived at the conclusion that, well, I don't think we can address this problem in time the right way. Because I don't think there's a way we can address the problem without violating people's freedoms and doing moral wrong to address a problem, and without going into the utilitarian calculations on, well, yeah, we're doing moral wrong to address the problem, but it saves the most human lives in the future. I don't like going into those kind of calculations anyway, because that's just open to a brevity of subjectivity. I just don't think there's a way, based on what I've observed in my personal experiences and in what I've seen trends in human behavior, a way that we can address this problem, which is on a scale much greater than individuals, without doing some moral wrong. But I do think I made the point, and I asserted that while we may not have the technology now to address the issue, by the time climate change, we start to see the negative effects, which are years out, and if not decades out. I'm not going to quote the specifics.
Yeah, decades out before we really start seeing a widespread problem. There are actually already some symptoms of it today, especially in places like India. They're having some problems now. But yeah, before over here in the United States or in more I guess is temperate the word I want to use? Temperate
yeah.
climates. Before people in those places start noticing it, yeah, it's going to be a few decades.
Sure.
But the window in which the window which we are presented with for addressing the issue is of a shorter time frame than when the symptoms will actually arise.
Right, because this is an issue that it's the issue of entering a feedback loop in which once you've entered it, there's no conceivable way you can exit it, and you will downward spiral through, and climate will downward spiral to a point where Earth becomes potentially uninhabitable for human beings, so on and so forth. This isn't a video about specifically climate change, but in a nutshell, that's the problem.
Right, there at some point, and it's disagreed upon where exactly this point is, but there is a threshold, a point of no return, where after we cross this threshold, the acceleration of the temperature change will exceed our ability to pull back from the feedback loop.
Right. And when we had gotten to that part of the discussion, I asserted that, well, we may not be able to reverse it now, but citing the rate of change in technological advancement, if they continue along trends that we've seen in the past, we first of all can't conceive what technologies we'll have access to at that time. And there's no way to prove it, because if we knew what technologies we could have, then why not just invent them now, for example? And it's really hard to know, like what prerequisite technologies you need. It doesn't work like that. It progresses, causally. You develop one technology that then enables you to develop another technology, and so on and so forth. But if we continue along the same progression rates, I asserted that it's feasible that we would have technology at that time. In all fairness, it wasn't just that it was feasible, but likely was my assertion that we would have a technology or access to technologies that would enable us to address the issue and maybe even reverse climate change. And so, in lieu of making a hard decision now, in maybe making morally deficient decisions now, why not act in a moral way to encourage technological growth, even if it may be at the cost in short term to the climate, then address the issue in the future when we don't have to choose between sacrificing, our moral selves to solve a problem. And that was my initial assertion.
Right, and so then my counter assertion is that this really, rather than it's less of an experiment. Let's see, where we'll be years from now, and by then we ought to have a better solution. It's more of a gamble.
It is.
If we do have a technological breakthrough, then we win the gamble, and we didn't have to do anything we didn't want to in order to solve the problem. But if we lose the gamble, we all die.
Well, humanity dies. At that point, you and I would probably die before then anyway, but
this is true.
But then again,
So I guess I'm operating from the
Position of certainty, almost.
Well, I was going to say from the viewpoint of I guess you could call it humanitarianism of
Okay. Okay, you're addressing the issue on a species scale,
right,
not an individual scale.
right, being more concerned about the fate of everybody than of ourselves, because yes, the likelihood that we would live to see the direct effects at all would be slim.
Right. So, and that's where we kind of left it, if I remember correctly. We didn't go. We had some other words about it, but essentially both of us kind of stood on our points and weren't able to go further than that because there was enough to digest getting to that point. Well, now here we are, almost a month later, I guess. And I don't think either of us have changed our minds on the issue either. However, I do think we've thought a lot more about it. And so I'm going to go ahead and, if that's okay with you, talk a little bit more about where I am on the issue. For me, I will concede the point that yes, it's a gamble. There's no arguing that it is a gamble. There's no experimentation to be done as far as just waiting and seeing, because at that point, inaction, in this case, of waiting and seeing on the issue of climate change, even if you're not inactive in your ability to develop new technologies, you can't undo that inaction. You can't run a parallel test where you have one group of people do nothing. There is no Earth 2 for us to do to have a control or anything like that. Either way, experiments on this scale are, impossible. I would argue
there is no contained experiment for this.
Right. As far as I have done a bit of research into how we as a species have quantified technological advancements before, because that was one of our original issues, is that how do you quantify technological advancement?
Right, because we casually throw around terms like, oh, technology doubles every however many years. It's like, yeah, but what does that mean?
Right, and it's not so, and one of the more convincing studies I found, and I'm not going to cite it directly right now, I'll link it for others to look at as well, but just in broad strokes, it isn't so much that we look at, again, it's still also subjective, full fairness, but it talks about it frames the issue not in technology doubling, but in how inconceivable technologies were, which is a good way of sort of saying the same thing. And the example goes that if you go back in the year 2000 to someone in 1970 and show them 2000's technology in 1970, it would appear impossible. But if you don't take someone from 2015 and go back to the year 2000, it's equally impossible. Like, that's kind of the contention. It's saying the same thing, but framing the issue slightly differently. And that is subjective. Some people use the number of transistors we can fit on a chip as a way of defining how good we are at technology.
And indeed, that's basically the argument of Moore's Law has to do with that,
right?
Because Moore's Law is specifically about computer technology.
It is, and admittedly, when we think of technology these days, it generally has to do with computers, because computers are
in everything now.
In everything, and they're in their own way becoming they already are a subset of types of machines in a way. Like,
right. Well, and it's not like, like the reason why our technology is so much better now is not because we are inventing all these new great machines. It's because we are putting better and better computers in everything.
Right. And computers, for example, have not even gotten that much faster necessarily. For example, without going too far into techno speak, when you're talking about speed in computers, you're generally talking about hertz, or how many operations per second you can do. This can come in the form of flops, which are floating point operations per second, which is floating point's a type of way of storing a unit. It's one of the more complex forms of storing a unit. Or it is how many ticks of the computer clock happen per second.
Or I guess this might be a legacy unit at this point, MIPS, million instructions per second.
Yeah, that's a really old one now.
Well, right. Well, because now we're in the billion of instructions per second. But
yeah,
but I guess the distinction between MIPS and the straight up clock speed is that our newer CPUs can get more done in one clock cycle than old ones did.
Right.
So the number of actual instructions that can be completed per second is different from the clock speed.
Well, that's what I was going to say. For example, you can buy a commercially available 3.4 gigahertz processor today, right? That's nothing to really scoff at. That's 3.4, roughly, billion operations per second if it only took one clock cycle to do each operation. We had that capability years ago. The difference is the chip you buy today has 4 of them on one instead of 1, or 8, or 16, or 32, up to 64, and so on and so forth. And so now, instead of doing one queue of things, or one, row of things really fast, let's do more than one row at a time, and it's optimizing that way. And there's many other ways we've optimized computers for our purposes as well. However, that still doesn't quite capture what is possible and what advancements are made. If anything, all it tells you is how complicated of a math problem you can solve in what little time. For example, basically all computing operations are a form of addition or subtraction, and that's it.
And guess what? Subtraction is a form of addition.
Is in subtraction form.
Actually, I think so. I watched an interesting thing recently about what's the minimum number of instructions you can have on a Turing complete computer. Do you know?
2.
1.
Okay.
You can do it in 1. Someone concocted an instruction which is, I don't think it has ever been actually implemented in hardware because we don't do that. But it's a combination subtract and compare operator.
I considered an operation as well, moving the tape as well, like memory addressing operation.
Anyway, okay.
Yeah, but still.
It actually handles the addressing as well, even within this subtraction operation.
That's fascinating.
It is great. I'll show it to you sometime. But anyway, we don't need to go down that tangent.
We don't need to go down that tangent too much. But still, the point is, you can, and it's how many of those can you do? And for example, even listening to this audio, all your computer is doing is going into a place in your in the computer's memory, not your memory yet, and pulling out a number and then doing math on that number that it can then feed to a physical circuit that, when given that number, makes that sound. And then it does a bunch of those in a row, and boom, you have audio. Same thing with video. Every frame you see is a bunch of numbers arranged in a grid, a 2D grid, and they represent a color and a hue and all that. And that's all it is. And the reason you can do high definition pictures these days is because you can just process more of those pixels per second, And that's all it's about. Doing the same problem we were doing 10 years ago, just so much faster. And in the in the scientific realm, that allows them to run models much more efficiently as well, because the more data points you have to play with, generally speaking, the better you can understand the model. For this, I think I might actually link a video on partial differential equations that talks about this. They're unsolvable math problems, for example, that you can essentially solve it by doing vector fields. And, for example, and without getting too mathy, it's the finer definition of your vector field, or the more points you have in this just space to see what would happen if at that given point of time, you can actually more accurately model what's going to happen in real life. There's a really good 3 blue 1 brown video on partial differential equations, or maybe it's higher order differential equations.
It's on differential equations.
Differential equations in general, yeah. But it talks about how these problems are not solvable most of the time. But you don't have to solve it to learn something from it. And that's the whole point, which is very different than how we attempted to solve scientific problems in the past. In the past, you had to prove it. And you had to prove it through rigorous mathematical proofs a lot of time. Like, you have to have a proof of concept, and you had to show that it's duplicatable every time and it follows a certain law. Well, we're entering this realm where we just simply don't have enough computing power that if we left it running for the rest of the time of the universe, it could actually solve the problem to be what is 100% confident to be real. Instead, you can get enough data points to get close enough, as an engineer would say. You can get close enough to know pretty predictably what will happen.
Right, and most of the time that is satisfactory to us as well, because for a lot of these problems, we're not trying to uncover the secrets of the universe. We're trying to engineer something.
Right, for our own benefit.
As long as our technology works, who cares how close to reality we got? It works.
Exactly. So, that all being said, I have to acknowledge that my assertion comes with a problem, and that is there is no way to prove it. And I concede that point. And with it, and at risk of falling into a fallacy necessarily, you can't prove a similar claim in the same way either. So I'm not trying to say that the opposite contention to what I have to say is false as well, because it's not saying that I'm wrong, and it's not saying that someone who says technology will get worse in the future is wrong. You just can't know.
Right. That's the real thing here, is that we cannot depend on, okay, I can say I would agree we probably can depend on technological improvements in the future. This is a pretty dependable thing, just by inductive reasoning.
Sure.
What we can't depend on is the creation of a specific technology or technologies which solve this problem.
Right. So, I think the real debate to be had here, because at this point, you're operating on a certainty. Well, on a scientific certainty, we'll say. Because it's not, as some would say, that the jury's still out on whether or not climate change is a problem that we need to address soon. It's pretty much, there's a high degree of confidence, high enough degree of confidence in the scientific community that it is a problem.
And the degree of confidence is high enough that a case could be made that arguing about whether the consensus is strong enough might be wasting valuable time.
Exactly.
And I scarcely see an argument to be made which would say that that we shouldn't become more efficient, let's say.
Right.
Like who's going around saying, no, we need to make more, gas guzzling vehicles and take down nuclear plants. Well, okay, there's people who fear nuclear power plants who would say that, but they're not saying that we need to burn coal for the sake of burning coal. It's a good thing to be more efficient with our energy. So it's not like the outcomes of, like, if we find out a few decades from now that we were totally mistaken about climate change, we will still have done a good thing by trying to stop it.
No, yeah, we would still benefit. The real debate being had, and this is what's more obvious about this discussion, is we have to do something now. And the real debate on is, well, what do we do? What lines do we cross? Because time is of the essence. Debating it for the next 50 years is the same as not doing anything. And that's the real problem. And where Techno Optimism gets involved in this even further is there is a, I think, general consensus that people would be willing to take the bet. There's a significant portion of the population who, whether they realize it or not, would bank on Techno Optimism as an outcome, as a reason to not do anything too drastic. Or when you do your cost benefit analysis on it, essentially, on each proposed method of addressing the situation, Techno Optimism weighs in that cost benefit analysis, even if it doesn't logically fit and it's not provable. It affects, it's a human psychological effect as well. And I'll admit that it affects me.
Like if we already had, somewhat reliable technology for removing, CO2 from the atmosphere and converting it to something else, something that doesn't contribute to the greenhouse effect, then the case is a lot stronger for techno optimism of, okay, we have this technology already, now it's just a matter of optimizing it.
Right. Well, and I think that's another thing too to keep in mind about the subject of techno optimism in general. Techno optimism when it comes to what? In this case, because we're talking about techno optimism more generally in this episode, but in the case of climate change, it's okay. You have to address that differently than you address the question of artificial intelligence, for example. Because it's very contextual. Because it's not necessarily a logical system of coming up with a solution or way of coming up with solutions. It can be somewhat empirical, but because the data set of technology or in the scope of technology in general is too broad, I think you can apply it more narrowly. Right.
Yeah, this is not a discussion of techno-optimism versus, well, I'll call it techno-pessimism as right. An opposite. Is techno-optimism in the context of climate change a delusion that is keeping us from solving a problem?
Right. And let's go ahead and go there. What is your contention?
My contention with techno-optimism in this context?
Yes, with the context of...
So, well, it's sort of already been raised that we cannot depend on sufficient technological advancements to solve the problem in the future.
Right, but that's in the general scope. I want to know in the scope of climate change.
But that's what I mean.
Okay.
Yeah, the problem here being climate change.
Okay.
That the clock is ticking, and for us to depend on something that is not dependable is irrational.
Okay.
Are you asking me to propose a counter solution?
No, of course not, because this is, if you had the solution to climate change, David, you should win a Nobel Prize. That would make everyone happy. But that's just the point I'm trying to get at, is that I'm aware of that.
Now, okay, I'll make an assertion about your position real quick, and you can validate it or not.
Certainly.
I would go and say that your objection to a solution, let's say a legislative solution, has to do with the fact that we are now stepping on people's freedom in order to solve a practical problem.
Right. I think maybe, to take it one step further, because I kind of see where you're going with this, I don't have to have... I think there's a logical fallacy here that people invoke as well. I don't have to have a solution to the problem to know that your solution is bad. I don't have to have a better solution to disagree with your solution. And that's something I think, not to quote anyone specifically, but that's what people seem to believe,
Okay.
I propose my solution, and if you don't have a solution, you can't tell me mine's bad. Come up with a better one. That's fallacious.
Right. That's exactly right. So let's take it this way then. Let's approach it with a question. Is it conceivable at all that there could perhaps be, regardless of how, okay, let's take it to the most extreme case, regardless of what rights get stepped on in the process, is it conceivable that some legislation could be written and enforced that would solve the problem, regardless of its side effects?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we establish first that there is a possible way to solve the problem with government. Okay. So then it's just a matter of what lines can be crossed.
That's fair,
If
but
any.
if any, but that's the other thing too, is it's possible a solution can be reached, but it may not be possible for a solution to be reached without crossing lines.
Right. That's why I explicitly said in there
Okay.
that it doesn't matter, like for purposes of that hypothetical, it doesn't matter how many people get stepped on or what other maybe arguably worse side effects happen. But just to establish that you're not disagreeing with the assertion that this problem could in principle be solved with government side effects, let alone.
Right.
Okay. So then, all right. So now, allow me to present the principal case that, given. So if we accept as a premise of the scenario here that the effects of climate change are inevitable given inaction, and we accept as a goal we would like to avoid them, then to what extent should we individually be willing to sacrifice our freedoms in order to preserve ourselves? Because, I'll use the analogy of driving. Let's say you're driving on a highway, an interstate, let's say, and a large truck would like to merge into your lane, but you have the right of way. If he merges anyway, does it matter how right you were if you're dead?
Well, therein lies a whole different problem.
You're right, but that's
the problem, though.
Yes.
And it's at this point where give me liberty or give me death becomes way more relevant than it used to be. I think there could be a better counter proposal, and that is it feasible that a solution can be reached without government? That's the next contention as well.
So and I'm also not contesting that a solution could be reached without government.
They're not mutually exclusive.
Correct. And I think I would further say that if we decided to go with a legislative solution to the problem, that as soon as a non-legislative solution came within reach, then the legislative solution should be abandoned.
Sure. Well, to quote one thing that I did say this at the same time, because we were discussing a little bit about how to address the second problem. I don't think we realized that it was for this reason, or at least maybe I didn't. And I made this, I essentially said, and this isn't new, coming from the mind of greatness, or even my own mind, not to inflate the two, but I said that, I repeated the assertion that in order for climate change to actually work, it needed to be profitable.
You mean a solution to climate change? You said in order for climate change to work.
For a solution to climate change to actually work and be effective, it needed to be profitable, because that was the biggest motivating factor.
Yep.
Because even if I agree to the contention that a legislative solution would need to be used in the short term, we live in a world where there's not just one government. And it's not just a legislative solution here in the United States.
It's going to have to be most everywhere.
Most everywhere. And not only that, but then you get into the issue of, we still have influence. And it's exercising international influence. And not to step down the road too far, but you could reach a point where it's like, okay, do we risk war trying to stop these people from doing something that was definitely going to kill us in the future if we take the scientific research to be as gospel, as we've said, is pretty accurate?
Well, yeah, just for framing the discussion, we'll take it as a certainty.
Okay. Well, logically speaking, we probably won't all die in a war, and some of us will live, And there you go. You could find and this is how these kind of discussions mean a lot more than they seem to mean on the surface.
Right.
Yeah. I think we've kind of strayed a bit from the topic of techno optimism at this point.
Yes.
And we talked about climate change in general, which, don't get me wrong, I think both are good segues to the other topic a bit.
I think that a discussion about techno optimism is only meaningful if we put it in a context. So this is one context.
Right. And just to go ahead and without wrapping up immediately, just to establish where we are, techno optimism is not a valid reason for suggesting any course of inaction or action.
Right.
And I guess I was in the wrong for using it as such in our original discussion. However, that does not mean you can't pursue using it generally. I think, for instance sake, we might be able to come up with a hypothetical in which techno-optimism could coming to the table with an argument that may be viewed as techno-optimism might actually be valuable, though. And you kind of already laid that case out, is within the scope of climate change, what technologies exist that can reverse the problem or stop the problem? Do they exist? And is it feasible in the most remote sense to implement them?
Yeah, can they be optimized and can they be scaled
right
to the literally planetary scale that they need to be
exactly
to work?
Exactly. And so in that case, you're not, but you have to abandon arguing from the state of technological optimism or techno-optimism, but actually start proposing a technological solution.
Correct.
And your optimism shouldn't just be, I feel good about this and it should be fine. It should be, and it shouldn't even come from, well, we've implemented things that we've needed in the past on a fast scale. It should be, you really have to go empirical at that point on the specific technologies you're talking about as far as their scalability. And at that point, you're now arguing scientifically and empirically, not from the point of, well, I think it'll be fine. I mean, look how well we've done so far. That's not an argument. That's just a contention.
It's just, fallacious application of inductive reasoning is what it is.
Right. I think that wraps it up, philosophers. But I do want to go ahead, since we're on the topic of techno-optimism, let's go ahead and open up one more can of worms since we've got some time to kill.
Okay.
I do think we might discuss climate change a little more in the future. Not to tuck my tail on this one, but I do think that needs to be its own.
Probably, because there are so many tangents that we could go down on that.
A ton.
Yep.
Right. But one other thing that's more directly tied to techno-optimism, where you hear it commonly discussed today, we already mentioned, was artificial intelligence.
Yep.
Just to lay out the problem with artificial intelligence, I want to go ahead and point out that, let's go ahead and introduce the topic a little bit. First, I would like to point out that there are 3 scientifically agreed on categories of artificial intelligence. There are, I forget the name for the first one because it's essentially dumb AI, or it's application-specific AI, essentially. For example, the self-driving car AIs, algorithms and programs we're making, all of these terms are loosely used as the same thing, even though they're not the same thing technically. It's really good at doing one thing. You can write an API for an AI that can drive a car, and it's really good at driving cars. But if you ask it what I want for dinner, those aren't parameters that it's,
or even a question that something else could feasibly answer, like what Italian restaurants are there in this city?
It's not optimized.
That's
for
really
that.
Specific, something that a computer would be good at answering, but not that.
Right. And another one, for example, is I'm show it a picture and say, hey, is this a picture of a 3 or a B? To kind of poke at another YouTube channel that's talked about it before. Actually, I'm going to go and link that video as well, because that's pretty good stuff. It's got image processing software in it, and it's been trained to know what a stop sign is, but it's not been trained to know what a 3 or a B is necessarily in that context, so it may not know. But you can write another AI that is really good at telling what a 3 is from a B, and it can do that all day.
And a funny quirk of this is that by the way that those are created, they are incentivized to be very confident about whatever answer they give. So if you show the 3 or B AI a picture of a turtle, it will very confidently tell you that it's either a 3 or a B.
Right, it's very certain. It's one of those two
Because
things.
it learned very early on that if it's uncertain about something, then it loses.
Right. Because otherwise, it would have no air quotes, incentive to get good. That's the first kind. That's the kind we already have. We've been developing for some time and are actually very prominent throughout the world today, whether you realize it or not.
Is neural network the term that you were trying to think of?
Yeah, neural network. That's it. The second type are general artificial intelligences, or intelligenci, whatever. Not to wordsmith. But these artificial intelligences are what you see in movies at the beginning of the movie about artificial intelligence, like iRobot and such. And they are AI programs that can do all of these things at once, and not only do them, but teach themselves to do these things. And in a rough way, have comparable intelligence to a human being. That's one way that it's often phrased, is that they are learning at the same rate as a person would learn. Or they're able to learn
analogously to humans.
Right.
Yeah.
And these are things, I guess the closest you'd have right now is the bundle of different AI, this application-specific AIs that we have in your personal digital assistants. They learned speech recognition. They're taught speech recognition, even though in reality it's a bunch of these application-specific AIs layered together. But it would be like that. It can understand what you say. It can do things that it's been taught to do on your phone. Like you learn to use the phone, but it's not doing any groundbreaking science or anything necessarily. It's doing what a human can do. It's just doing it for you.
Right, or like a more famous example might be IBM Watson, things like that. Where it got its fame from competing on Jeopardy and beating everybody.
Right, but keep in mind these don't exist right now either. Now, truly, they don't exist right now.
Right, it's just an illusion.
It's a concept, yes, and an illusion. Anything you can see,
like your phone digital assistant
is an illusion. Yes.
Yes.
IBM Watson is somewhat of an illusion, but he's also chained down pretty hard, and there's for good reason for that. Because the third type of artificial intelligence is an artificial super intelligence. They came up with the word, not me. I think Nick Bostrom, who has a really good book on super intelligence, which I'll link as well. And he's done plenty of lectures about it. It's Nick Bostrom, right? Bostrom is his last name. Anyway, I'll link it below. This type of intelligence learns at a rate that's exponential. It can learn how to learn, and because it can learn how to learn better. And because it can learn how to learn better, it can teach itself how to learn better, and it just gets exponentially more intelligent. Not smarter. It doesn't accumulate knowledge at a faster rate necessarily.
Until it learns to,
but it learns to learn at a faster rate. And this is referred to as a superintelligence because this is something that humans cannot do.
Right. We can learn as fast as we can learn because of our biology, our physiology, and that's it.
Right. There will not be a way conceivable that humans can attain superintelligence by themselves, biologically.
Right. There is not an experience that we can have that will make us,
more intelligent necessarily.
Right.
It's something that you can learn better ways to learn, but it'll always be linear. You will accumulate knowledge. You can find ways to marginally increase the amount of knowledge you're able to accumulate.
Right. Well, I guess to some extent we can learn better techniques, science is better than inductive reasoning.
Right.
So there are methods like this, but there's a trade-off there too. Science also takes longer.
Right. But essentially, in the context of this AI, it's doing it, for example, it can learn, say we can quantify units of knowledge. There's some subjective term for you. But say it can learn 1 knowledge unit per hour. Well, for the first 4 hours, it would learn 4 knowledge units. It learns a better way to learn. So the next 4 hours, it learns 8 knowledge units, then 16, then 32, then 64, and then it keeps going. A human will almost always continue to learn about 4 knowledge units an hour, say, of an average intelligence. So it's not that it can live a long time because it's not biological. It's that it will just learn. It will take off. And within an unknown amount of time, become vastly more intelligent than if you could somehow sum the sum of human intelligence of all time, or of all living intelligence in the universe, besides other artificial intelligences.
It will be able to learn and figure things out faster than if everyone got together and tried to solve a problem, they could solve it faster.
Right. The problem with the AI question is that general AI, in order for them to become what we really think we want them to be, can become super AI very quickly. And to illustrate the problem even further, application-specific AI, or dumb AI, take years to make and train because they're being trained by humans. Even if it's through an automated process on a computer, we still have to train them with data that we have to cater to it and make sure that the test is, the testing for confidence in what is a B or a 3 has to be handed to it and run through iterations, right? And it takes years to get to that point. It takes even longer to get to the point where you could have a general intelligence. But once you get a general intelligence and you flip the switch on, you have a super intelligence possibly within hours. And it's because of nothing you've done. It taught itself. And the Techno Optimism argument here is it'll be fine, just turn it on. Because there's a classic example of this, which is truly speaking to the problem of artificial intelligence research, is take the mindset of the scientist who's working on the artificial intelligence. And he knows this because he studies it. He knows that a general artificial intelligence can jump to a super artificial intelligence really fast. Well, right now we have all kinds of policies in place. Like most companies right now that work on AI have a rule: don't plug it into the internet. Don't do it, because that's where we keep most of the information. Because right now, if you let it loose, it can only accumulate so much knowledge before there's just nothing else for it to learn, right? So don't plug it into the internet. So he's told this, and he looks at it and goes, "Man, I'm gonna die in 20 years, 20 to 30 years. I'm in my 50s, so 20 to maybe 40 years if I'm really lucky. I'm going to die. That's a 100% certainty. Much like our climate change certainty from earlier. If we don't do anything, we'll die. If he does anything, he will die. Except it's conceptual that a super artificial intelligence, or an artificial super intelligence, could discover a cure for aging, or it could give us the gift of immortality through some way we can't conceive of. That's not certain, but it's more within the realm of possibility for a techno-optimist. Right? So he's confronted with a choice he has to make every day, that he or she has to make every day when they work on their artificial intelligence. I can obey the rules and within all certainty die, because we're not going to figure out the problem before I die. Like if I look at how things are progressing, I probably will die before we find the solution. Or I can plug it into the internet and let it run, and there's a slim chance that I'll live forever. When you're confronted with that choice, I don't know many people who can easily choose one or the other. That's a hard choice. That'd be like me pointing a gun at you and saying, "David, there are 2 bullets in this gun. I've randomly spun the chamber. One of them will make you immortal and one will definitely kill you. Now, I can either not point the gun at you and shoot you right now, or I can shoot you with one of those bullets. Which one do you want?" And as absurd as that sounds, when you're talking about living forever and defeating death, which is a huge existential crisis that has been creeping on humanity for years, for the entirety of our existence, those are some pretty high stakes, my friend. That's kind of a hard decision to make. And that's where we have this conversation is, if you're a techno-optimist and you're going to pull the lever, you're going to pull the lever. And you could and both of these things are on similar scales because they both affect the humanity on a species level. These questions do. Because artificial superintelligence is not going to... We're pretty confident that we could not stop one once it gets going. Because it'll become inconceivable.
It could outsmart us.
Well, it's not only could, but it will, essentially. It's an almost scientific certainty that it will. Now, to what end? We don't know. But that's the problem. How do you set... And that's the real question that's being addressed in the artificial intelligence community is, how do you set initial conditions that give us the outcome that we want when you can't conceivably do the math on those outcomes because it's in a space and trajectory of superintelligence that you can't fathom? How can you do the math on that? And ultimately, some argue that it's an unanswerable question. You can't know until you turn on the switch. And so essentially, you get one chance to set those initial conditions and hope that it's right. And this is at this point where I'm not confident enough in the science on, what can be done. There are people who do study it. And I think I'm also going to link the computer file video on the AI stop button problem, because that's an example. They come up with hypotheticals on how to test the problem. And so far, from what I've read, all we've done is seen how bad the problem can be and not seen any convincing evidence. And that leads to the question of, well, should we just never do it? But that's a pretty awful, imagine how, you don't have to imagine, look at how people felt about nuclear weapons. All you had to do is not shoot them at people. Well, anyone who's ever seen a small human knows that telling people not to do something is one of the worst ways to get them to not do it. And once you realize that these things exist, you can't unknow them either, and the enticing offer's there for a lifetime.
Also, knowledge just wants to be free, and so somebody out there is going to figure out how to do it and do it anyway.
Exactly. And so then the question goes, well, do we just do it anyway? And you don't know when that's going to happen.
In our little controlled environment, I say controlled as in the engineers who made it have control over whether the machine is running, at least for a bit.
Exactly. But this is one of those places where you will hear arguments or people comment from a techno-optimistic versus techno-pessimistic perspective. Some people say, let it rip, let's see what happens, screw it, let's go. Some people say we should avoid this like the plague and even legislate measures to make AI research illegal everywhere in the world, and it's worth the war. You might, like, for example, a good example given is North Korea is working on building nukes right now when they really should be working on developing an artificial superintelligence, because that's the more dangerous weapon, arguably. It is more beneficial, and these people would go to the strength of saying, turn North Korea into a sheet of glass, nuke the whole thing, because whatever consequence comes of that has a higher probability of successful outcome for the majority of humanity than if they actually succeed, right? But I think anybody, I don't want to say it's common sense, but like you said, information wants to be free, and people are going to do it and figure it out eventually.
Right. All this is, it's just highly sophisticated mathematics. You can't hide this from people. It can be derived.
Exactly. So when it comes, but it's the same conclusion from the perspective of techno optimism. You can't say, let it rip, because I'm sure it'll be fine, because you don't know. For the same reason, you can't necessarily say, don't do it, because it'll probably be bad. You don't know. I think it's the same answer. Do your research. It needs to be empirical. But also, like the climate change problem, not to be too ominous, but the clock's ticking, because
the information is busy being free right now.
It's busy being free, and you don't know who's going to be the first person to say screw it. And it's a tough problem, because you have to work on the solution with a deadline when you don't know what the deadline is. And that's a whole other thing. But it's so easy, it seems, to just say, it'll be fine. Let it rip. And it also seems so easy to say, it'll be terrible. We just need to try to stop it at all costs and postpone, the doom as much as we can. But both of those things are fallacious. And I think we should lastly examine the harm that can be done by taking either the techno-optimistic or techno-pessimistic stance from these issues. I guess this video is about both techno-optimism and pessimism because they're just two halves of the same coin. It's advocating for a position just because you feel like it or because you don't feel like it. The obvious issue with both of these is that they are ill-informed decisions, and especially when you argue and try to reach a consensus, they are useless because, as we discovered when I first invoked our techno-optimism, you just get nowhere. I'm going to stop having a debate about it because there's no way to reconcile techno-optimism, and there's no way to reconcile techno-pessimism either. So I think that's the biggest negative ramification of the two. Would you say?
Yeah, I'd agree.
I also don't foresee any benefit of either, besides maybe a social engineer's dream of just putting people at ease.
Right.
Like, let's avoid the panic in the short term by letting everyone think it'll be okay, even if that's dishonest. But that still may not be a good thing. So, I don't know. I think, more than anything else, it's okay to be optimistic as long as you don't argue from a position of optimism. Because optimism, as far as mental health and how you conduct your daily life, I think is a positive thing.
Well, sure. Yeah, there is real science behind that. That's not just a conjecture. If you go around worrying about the horrible ways that things could go wrong all the time, it's devastating for your mental health, and you'll probably just kill yourself.
Right, and that's no good to you or anyone else. Probably. And so I think that's the grain of salt with that too, is, it's not, and I think too many people, because when I talk about these two subjects, or any subject that begins to encroach on the underlying topic of existential doom, which is not a fun topic when you go at it for an hour or two with somebody, it's important to remember that you can still be optimistic, and that whilst these decisions and these facts of reality are huge and beyond maybe one individual, it may seem beyond you as an individual's ability to affect, that's not entirely true. Possibly. That's not to say that you can't have a say in how it all is done. Just don't argue from that position, get informed about it. And I think that's, there's a different discussion that we need to have on why people avoid science and why people avoid hard facts, because they suck to feel.
Yep.
But and that's another thing too. I know it's easy to say, just, you can still be optimistic, but you can't bank on that optimism. And just because these things are terrible to think about and hard doesn't mean that, because you also see techno optimism, I think, is kind of also a branch of, well, we just don't know. And people actually start taking solace in uncertainty in a way.
Which is bad.
Which is very bad. But when it comes to, we've talked a lot about scope switching. Well, when it comes to the scope of you and your life as a person, and especially how you feel, I think a lot of people's first instincts not only are towards self-preservation physically, but it's towards mental self-preservation as well. And people will tend to shoo away dark thoughts by either slapping a generic techno optimism on it, like it'll be fine, or saying we don't know enough. I think, to revisit the climate change, when people castigate other people for being climate change deniers, but really, it's kind of understandable where those people come from. Climate change is a hard thing. And there's a reason you see climate change deniers who aren't what you would consider to be just uneducated masses. There are very smart people who deny the problem, but we're all human. And if anything else, I think the first thing to do when we address these serious topics is, don't underscore the gravity of the situation, but I think we won't get anywhere when everyone's panicking about it either. There's a balance that needs to be taken in addressing those things, and I'm not quite sure what that is. And I think that might even be a discussion for a different time.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's like the ultimate struggle of anyone who's trying to be productive, is to remain cool and collected, but also highly focused on a goal. It's hard to be that way.
Exactly.
Because you know, I say this as someone who struggles with this as part of his day job, and I'm sure everyone else in a similar line of work does the same. Where you're struggling between, this isn't exactly urgent. I can slack a little bit, and then of course the deadline begins to approach, and then it beats down on you more. Hey, by the way, you need to get this done, and then you get to enjoy a few weeks of stress while you actually solve what you were supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
It's hard to achieve focus, and I'm trying to think of a fancy word for it, but just calmness.
Mental complacency almost.
Well, not complacency. The fancy word that I was thinking of was serenity, but it just seems very, very pretentious. But
yes. Where's your cup of tea there, Professor? No, I'm just kidding. No, I agree. That's also a really fascinating thing. The human cycle of panic to lethargy, almost, to use another fancy term.
Well, and there's a lot of science behind that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we just we have a hard time with future problems.
Yes, we do.
Future problems will get here when the future gets here.
Exactly.
And we'll deal with them then.
Hey,
and we do.
Future problems require future solutions. There's your meme for the day, everybody. Your Fauxlosophers inspired meme. Okay, well, I think the horse is about dead, or it's been dead for a bit. So, one other thing I'd like to point out as we close is, David, as I examine the audio files toward the end, I realized you need to talk more. I talk way too much in the most recent episodes.
Well, that's why we gave you the title of Philosopher's Windbag. Well, you gave yourself that title, actually.
I did. So I think maybe next week you should propose a title, and I can take a break, because my poor vocal cords, David, they have just been vibrating all aflutter, and I just can't keep it going.
Well, perhaps our topic for next week should be first world problems.
First world problems. People listen to me too much. Oh, man. All right. Well, that all being said, Fauxlosophers.